Hey guys, and welcome to Mysterious Sleepy History, the channel where the doors to the mysterious worlds of history are opened. Tonight, I want you to forget about the world outside for a while, get comfortable, find a peaceful place to rest, and let yourself drift into another time, a time of ancient walls, bronze armor, distant fires, and a city surrounded by war. Tonight, our journey takes us to Troy. And at the heart of this ancient story stands one warrior above all others, Achilles. A warrior believed to be nearly unbeatable. But what was it that brought him to the edge of destruction? And what was the reason behind the rage that lies at the heart of the epic story of the Iliad? Before we begin, if you enjoy having a knight companion beside you, telling you the deepest stories from history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Mysterious Sleepy History. This will help us reach more knight companions and grow our community. And I'm also curious, where in the world are you joining me from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Before we get too deep into the story, let me know in the comments. I want to know who is joining me beneath the starry skies of your beautiful city tonight, and discover which city has the most knight companions listening with me. Tonight's story is filled with heroes, kings, gods, friendship, betrayal, love, grief, and the terrible cost of war. Now close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the mysterious world I'm about to tell you about to slowly appear before your eyes. Because this is the true story of Achilles, Troy, and the war that was immortalized in the pages of the Iliad. Long before the walls of Troy became a symbol of war, before poets gave names to its heroes and generations of people whispered their stories beneath the stars, there stood a city overlooking the blue waters of the Aegean. It was a city of high stone walls, wide gates, quiet courtyards, crowded markets, and palaces filled with gold, bronze, woven cloth, and the voices of countless people. At night, when the fires were lit along the walls, Troy must have seemed almost like a world of its own, protected from everything beyond its gates. And yet, for years, the people of Troy had lived beneath the shadow of an army. Beyond the walls, across the plain, the Greeks had built their camps. Their ships rested along the distant shore, their dark wooden hulls rising and falling with the waves. Thousands of warriors had come from the islands and kingdoms of Greece, bringing bronze shields, long spears, helmets, horses, and memories of a homeland far away. They had come for Troy, and they had remained for years. The war had become so old that for many of the younger soldiers, it was almost all they had ever known. They had grown up beneath the sound of weapons. They had learned to sleep while guards watched the walls. They had learned to recognize the distant calls of soldiers and the flickering light of fires across the plain. Every morning, they could look toward the horizon and see the enemy still waiting. And every evening, when darkness covered the battlefield, the people of Troy could return behind their gates and hope that another day had passed without losing someone they loved. At the center of this city stood its royal family. King Priam was already an old man. He had ruled Troy through years of prosperity and through years of war, and he had watched his sons grow into warriors. Among them, none was more respected than Hector. Hector was not simply a prince. He was the defender of Troy. When the people looked toward the walls and saw him standing there in his bronze armor, they saw the strength of their city. He was a warrior, a son, a husband, and a father. He knew that behind those walls were not only soldiers, but families, children, merchants, craftsmen, servants, and old people who depended upon him. And then there was his younger brother, Paris. Where Hector was known for duty and courage, Paris was remembered for something very different. His story had begun not on the battlefield, but with beauty, desire, and a choice that would eventually bring armies to the shores of Troy. Paris was a prince of Troy, but his life became entangled with one of the most famous women in the ancient world, Helen. Helen had been married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. She was said to be extraordinarily beautiful, and her beauty had become part of the legends surrounding the war long before the walls of Troy were finally breached. According to the ancient tradition, Paris came to Sparta and encountered Helen there. What happened between them has been told in different ways across the centuries. Some stories describe love and desire. Others place the gods themselves behind their meeting, as though human beings were merely moving along a path that had already been chosen for them. Whatever the truth of the old stories, Helen eventually left Sparta with Paris and traveled across the sea to Troy. And when Menelaus discovered that his wife was gone, the consequences reached far beyond one marriage. Kings who had once made promises to defend Helen gathered their armies. Ships were prepared. Warriors crossed the sea. And the great Greek expedition began its journey toward Troy. But the story of Troy is not simply the story of a woman, or of a prince, or even of two kingdoms. It is the story of what happens when pride, love, honor, anger, and fate become tangled together. For years, the Greeks remained outside the city, and among all the warriors who came with them, there was one whose name would eventually become greater than the war itself. His name was Achilles. He was still young, but already his reputation had spread through the Greek camp. Men spoke of his speed, his strength, and the terrible skill with which he carried a spear. Some believed that no warrior could stand before him for long, yet Achilles was more than simply a great fighter. He was a man caught between two possible lives. One path promised him a long and quiet existence, a life that would eventually fade into ordinary memory. The other promised something completely different: glory. A short life, perhaps, but a name that would survive long after his body had disappeared beneath the earth. And Achilles chose glory. He could not yet know what that choice would cost him. He could not know that one day his greatest strength would become his greatest weakness. He could not know that his anger would bring suffering to thousands of men. And he certainly could not know that the friendship he treasured most would eventually pull him back onto the battlefield. For now, however, the war continued. The fires of the Greek camp flickered beneath the stars. Along the walls of Troy, guards walked slowly through the darkness. Inside the city, families slept, unaware of what the next morning might bring. Somewhere in the palace, Helen looked out toward the distant fires. Somewhere among the soldiers, Hector prepared himself for another day of war. And beyond the walls, among the tents of the Greek army, Achilles rested beneath the night sky, unaware that his greatest battle would not begin with a spear or a sword. It would begin with an insult. It would begin with wounded pride. And it would begin with anger. The anger of Achilles. Helen had been famous long before the walls of Troy appeared on the horizon. In the old stories, she was known as Helen of Sparta, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and a woman whose beauty was said to have inspired admiration wherever she went. But beauty, in the world of ancient myth, was never simply a gift. It could become a burden, a source of desire, and sometimes even the beginning of disaster. When Helen was young, many powerful Greek kings and princes wished to marry her. Her beauty was so renowned that her suitors came from different kingdoms, each hoping to become her husband. Among them was Menelaus, the prince of the house of Atreus. Eventually, Helen became the wife of Menelaus, and together they lived in Sparta. For a time, their story seemed like the beginning of an ordinary royal life, but the gods had already begun moving pieces across the board. Far away in Troy, a young prince named Paris was growing into manhood. Paris was not like his brother Hector. Hector was known for his discipline, courage, and sense of duty. Paris was more closely associated with beauty, pleasure, and desire, and Paris had already encountered the gods. According to the ancient story, 3 goddesses once appeared before him: Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite. Each believed that she was the most beautiful, and they asked Paris to decide which of them deserved the golden apple that had been offered to the fairest. Paris was asked to make a choice that no ordinary mortal should ever have been asked to make. Hera offered him power. Athene offered wisdom and victory in war, but Aphrodite offered something different. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and that choice would eventually lead him to Helen. Years later, Paris traveled to Sparta as a guest of Menelaus. The palace welcomed him. There were feasts, conversations, music, and the customs of hospitality that were considered sacred among the ancient Greeks. A guest was meant to be protected, and a host was expected to offer safety beneath his roof. But Paris did not leave Sparta as he had arrived. He left with Helen. The ancient sources do not tell the story in exactly the same way. Some traditions portray Helen as willingly following Paris. Others suggest that she was taken against her will. Some emphasize the power of Aphrodite and the irresistible force of desire. And perhaps this uncertainty is part of what makes the story so fascinating. Was Helen truly in love with Paris? Was Paris truly in love with Helen? Or were they simply caught inside a chain of events that had begun long before either of them understood what was happening? Whatever their feelings may have been, Paris returned to Troy with Helen. And when Menelaus discovered that his wife had disappeared, the quiet life of Sparta came to an end. His grief became anger. His anger became a demand for justice, and his demand would eventually become a war. Menelaus called upon his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae. Together, they turned to the old promise that many of Helen's former suitors had once made. They had sworn to defend Helen's marriage and to stand together if anyone attempted to take her away. Now the promise was being called upon. One by one, the Greek kings and princes gathered their forces. Ships were prepared along the shores. Bronze armor was polished. Spears were carried aboard. Horses were loaded. Men said goodbye to their wives, their children, their parents, and the quiet lives they had known. Among those who answered the call was Achilles. With him came other famous warriors, including Odysseus and Ajax, each carrying his own reputation, his own ambitions, and his own fears. Soon the coastline filled with ships. Hundreds of vessels waited upon the sea, their sails ready to catch the wind. Then, one by one, they began to move. The Greek fleet sailed toward Troy. Across the Aegean, beneath open skies and restless seas, thousands of men traveled toward a city they had never seen. And waiting for them behind its enormous walls were Hector, Paris, King Priam, Helen, and the people of Troy. Neither side could yet know how long the war would last. Neither could imagine the number of lives that would be lost. And no one could know that the conflict would become far greater than the question of one marriage. Because once the armies arrived at Troy, the story would no longer belong only to Helen and Paris. It would belong to Achilles, to Hector, to Patroclus, to Priam, to the gods who watched from above, and to the countless men who would die beneath the walls of the city. The ships had arrived, the armies were ready. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, Troy was waiting. But the greatest tragedy had not yet begun, for the war would soon reveal that the most dangerous enemy on the Greek side was not standing behind the walls of Troy. It was already among them, and his name was Achilles. Achilles was born into a world where gods and mortals sometimes crossed paths, and his birth itself seemed to carry the promise of something extraordinary. His father was Peleus, a mortal king and a great warrior. His mother was Thetis, a divine sea goddess, ancient and mysterious, who belonged to the world beneath the waves. Their union was unusual from the beginning. A goddess had married a mortal man, and from that marriage came a child who would never quite belong entirely to either world. That child was Achilles. From his mother, Achilles inherited something of the divine. From his father, he inherited the blood of a warrior. And from the moment he entered the stories of the ancient Greeks, it seemed that an unusual destiny was waiting for him. Later traditions would tell many stories about Achilles as a child. Some say that Thetis tried to protect him from the fate she knew was waiting for him. Other traditions say that he was trained by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him the arts of medicine, hunting, music, and warfare. There are also stories that Thetis attempted to hide him from the coming Trojan War by sending him to the island of Skyros, where he lived disguised among the daughters of King Lycomedes. But eventually, the world found him. And when Achilles finally joined the Greek expedition against Troy, he was still young. Yet age meant very little when people spoke of his abilities. Achilles was fast, almost impossibly fast. He was a master of the spear, a powerful warrior, and a man whose courage seemed to grow stronger when surrounded by danger. His enemies feared the moment they saw him approaching across the battlefield. Among the Greeks, his name carried a different kind of weight. He was not simply another soldier. He was the warrior they sent when the battle seemed impossible. The warrior who could break through an enemy line. The warrior whose presence could change the course of a battle. And there was something else that made Achilles different. He knew that his life would not be long. The ancient stories surrounding Achilles are deeply connected to the idea of fate. The gods might influence the world. They might protect a man, guide him, or punish him. But even the gods often seemed unable to completely escape the mysterious order of destiny. Achilles was aware that his life had been placed before him like two different paths. One path led home. If he abandoned the war and returned to his homeland, he could live for many years. He could grow old. He could build a quieter life and perhaps die surrounded by the people who loved him. But there would be no great song about him. No distant generation would remember his name. The other path led toward Troy. If he remained, he would probably die young. His life would be short, but his name would become immortal. Long after his body had disappeared, people would still speak of Achilles. They would tell stories of his courage, his strength, his anger, his friendship, and his terrible fate. And Achilles understood the choice. That is what makes his story so haunting. He was not simply a man who accidentally walked toward his death. He knew that glory and death were waiting together. He knew that the greater his fame became, the closer he came to the end of his life. And still, he chose Troy. Perhaps this is one of the reasons Achilles has remained so powerful in the imagination of people for thousands of years. He was not invincible because he had no fear. He was extraordinary because he knew what he could lose. Every time he entered the battlefield, there was something hanging over him that his enemies could not see. His future, his fate, the knowledge that one day, perhaps sooner than anyone around him could imagine, his spear would fall silent. And yet, while Achilles was still young, none of this seemed important to the soldiers around him. They saw only the warrior. They saw the bronze armor shining beneath the sun. They saw the spear in his hands. They heard the cries of men who had survived encounters with him. And they began to speak his name with something close to awe. Achilles became the greatest warrior among the Greeks, but greatness has a price. The more famous he became, the more people expected from him. The more powerful he became, the more deeply he felt every insult. And beneath the armor of the greatest warrior in Greece was a young man who wanted something that even victory could not guarantee. He wanted honor. He wanted recognition. He wanted his worth to be acknowledged. And when that honor was taken from him, the warrior who could defeat almost anyone would discover that there was one battle he could not win with a spear: the battle against his own anger. Soon, Achilles would stand before Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek army. Words would be exchanged. Pride would collide with pride, and something would happen that would change the entire course of the war. Achilles would put down his weapons. He would turn away from the battlefield, and while Troy waited behind its walls, the greatest warrior of the Greek army would choose not to fight. That decision would become the beginning of his rage, and the beginning of the story for which the Iliad would remember him forever. By the time the Greek army had spent years outside the walls of Troy, war had become a strange kind of life. The soldiers had learned to live between battles. They slept beneath rough shelters, ate beside small fires, repaired their shields, sharpened their spears, and waited for another morning of fighting. The distant walls of Troy remained almost unchanged, standing above the plain like a silent reminder that after all those years, the city still refused to fall. For Achilles, however, the war had brought more than glory. Like the other warriors, he had taken part in raids against nearby cities and settlements that supported Troy. In those raids, prisoners were taken and divided among the commanders as part of the spoils of war. Among those prisoners was a young woman named Briseis. She was given to Achilles. The ancient poem does not present their relationship in the way a modern love story might. Briseis was a captive, taken from her home by an army at war, and Achilles' connection with her existed within the harsh customs of the ancient battlefield. Yet the Iliad makes it clear that when Briseis was taken away from him, Achilles experienced the loss as a deeply personal humiliation, and that moment would change everything. The trouble began with another captive woman. Her name was Chryseis, and she had been taken by Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces. But Chryseis was the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo. Her father came to the Greek camp carrying gifts and asking for his daughter to be returned. Agamemnon refused. Soon afterward, a plague began spreading through the Greek army. The soldiers became sick. Men who had survived years of battle began dying in their tents. Fear spread through the camp. Eventually, Achilles called for an assembly and demanded that they discover why the gods had turned against them. A prophet named Calchas revealed the reason. Apollo was angry because his priest's daughter had not been returned. Agamemnon finally agreed to give Chryseis back, But he would not accept the loss quietly. If he had to surrender his prize, he declared, then he would take another. And the woman he chose was Briseis. She belonged to Achilles. When Achilles heard what Agamemnon intended to do, something inside him broke. This was not simply about Briseis. It was about honor. In the world of these warriors, honor was not an abstract idea. It was visible. It was measured through gifts, prizes, recognition, and the respect given to a man's achievements. Achilles had fought harder than almost anyone. He had risked his life again and again. He had helped the Greeks win victories that might otherwise have been impossible. And yet, Agamemnon, the commander of the entire army, was now taking away the very symbol of the honor Achilles believed he had earned. Achilles confronted him. The argument between the two men became fierce. Achilles accused Agamemnon of taking advantage of the warriors who did the actual fighting. Agamemnon, however, refused to be intimidated by the greatest warrior in Greece. Their anger rose. Around them stood the other Greek commanders, watching two powerful men allow their pride to collide. For a moment, it seemed possible that Achilles might kill Agamemnon. His hand moved toward his sword, and then Athene appeared to him. The goddess restrained his anger and persuaded him not to strike. Achilles lowered his hand, but he did not forgive. Instead, he spoke words that would change the course of the war. He would no longer fight for Agamemnon. He would no longer fight for the Greek army. Let them fight without him. Let them discover what the battlefield looked like without Achilles. And so Briseis was taken from his tent. She was led away while Achilles watched. The greatest warrior in Greece had been humiliated in front of the very army that depended upon him. And now he walked away. He returned to his tent beside the sea and sat apart from the army. The battlefield continued beyond him. The Greek soldiers still prepared their weapons. The fires still burned. The ships still rested along the shore. But Achilles was gone. For the Greeks, it was an unimaginable loss. For Achilles, it was a moment of withdrawal from a world that he believed had failed to recognize his worth. He called upon his mother, Thetis, the divine sea goddess. And when she came to him, Achilles told her what had happened. He asked her to go to Zeus. He wanted the king of the gods to help the Trojans defeat the Greeks for a time, so that the Greek army would understand how much it needed him. Thetis agreed. She rose from the shore and went to Olympus, and Zeus listened. From that moment onward, the balance of the war would begin to change. Without Achilles, the Greeks would struggle. Without Achilles, the Trojans would grow bolder. And somewhere behind the walls of Troy, Hector would soon see an opportunity that had not existed before. The greatest warrior among the Greeks had chosen not to fight, but Achilles did not yet understand what his anger would cost. He believed that by withdrawing, he was defending his honor. He believed that the Greeks would eventually realize how much they needed him, and perhaps they would. But war does not wait patiently for wounded pride to heal. Every day that Achilles remained inside his tent, men died outside. Every day, the Trojans moved closer to the Greek ships. Every day, the consequences of one man's anger grew larger. This is where the true tragedy of Achilles begins, because the Iliad is not simply a story about a warrior who became angry. It is a story about what anger can do when it belongs to someone powerful enough to change the fate of an entire army. Achilles had been given a choice. He could return to battle and continue fighting for a cause that had insulted him, or he could remain silent and allow the Greeks to suffer without him. He chose silence, and outside his tent, the war continued. The Greeks would soon learn that Achilles was not merely their greatest warrior. He was the shield that had protected them from the full force of Troy. And once that shield was removed, the battlefield would become a very different place. The anger of Achilles had begun with a single woman being taken from his tent. But before long, that anger would reach far beyond Briseis. It would bring death to friends. It would bring glory to enemies. It would bring a father to the tent of the man who killed his son. And eventually, it would lead Achilles toward the fate he had always known was waiting for him. The rage had begun, and Troy was about to feel its consequences. For a while, Achilles remained inside his tent. Outside, the war continued without him. The Greek soldiers still woke before sunrise. They still tightened the straps of their shields, lifted their spears, and walked toward the battlefield. The bronze of their armor still caught the morning light, and the cries of the warriors still rose across the plain. But something had changed. Achilles was no longer there, and the Trojans noticed. For years, the sight of Achilles entering the battlefield had been enough to make even experienced warriors hesitate. His absence gave them courage. Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and the greatest defender of Troy, began to lead his people with renewed confidence. He was not reckless. He knew that the Greeks were still powerful. But now, without Achilles, the balance seemed to be shifting. Hector led the Trojan warriors beyond their walls. They pushed the Greeks back across the plain. Their attacks became stronger, their confidence grew, and soon the Greek camp itself was in danger. The Greeks began to retreat. Men who had once believed they would eventually conquer Troy now found themselves fighting simply to survive. The Trojan army moved closer to the Greek ships, and for the first time in many years, the possibility of complete disaster began to hang over the Greek camp. Agamemnon could see what was happening. His pride had brought him into conflict with Achilles, but pride could not stop the Trojans. One by one, the Greek leaders began to understand the terrible price of Achilles' absence. Agamemnon finally admitted what he had not wanted to admit before. He had gone too far. He would return Briseis. He would give Achilles gifts, gold, bronze, fine treasures, even promises of greater rewards. He would offer apologies and ask the greatest warrior in Greece to return to the battlefield. A delegation was sent to Achilles. Odysseus came. Phoenix, the old man who had helped raise Achilles, came. Ajax came as well. They entered Achilles' tent while the sounds of battle could still be heard in the distance. They found him sitting apart from the fighting. Achilles listened. They told him about the gifts Agamemnon was offering. They reminded him of the danger facing the Greeks. They asked him to return, but Achilles refused. The gifts meant nothing to him now. The promises meant nothing. He had already given enough. He had risked his life countless times while Agamemnon sat above the army and claimed the rewards. Now that the Greeks were losing, they suddenly remembered how valuable Achilles was. But Achilles' anger had hardened into something deeper. He did not want gold. He did not want more prizes. He wanted his honor restored. And he did not believe that Agamemnon's gifts could repair what had been broken. Outside the tent, the battle continued. Inside, Achilles remained still. He could hear the distant cries. He could imagine the clash of bronze, but he did not move, and that decision would have consequences. The Trojans continued their advance. Hector became more confident with every victory. The Greek warriors fought desperately to protect their ships. Their camp, once a place of strength, was beginning to feel like a trap. The sea lay behind them. Troy stood before them, and between the two waited Hector and the Trojan army. As night fell, the fires of Troy burned brightly in the distance. Inside his tent, Achilles remained alone. He had won the argument with Agamemnon, but there was a terrible question beginning to emerge. What happens when a man wins his honor but loses everything else? Achilles had wanted the Greeks to understand how much they needed him. Now they did. But understanding had come at a terrible price. Men were dying, ships were burning, and the enemy was getting closer. Soon, Achilles would have to face a truth that no amount of pride could change. The war would not stop simply because he had walked away. And fate would not wait for him to decide when he was ready to return. There was a man inside the walls of Troy who carried the weight of the entire city upon his shoulders. His name was Hector. He was the eldest son of King Priam, the husband of Andromache, and the father of a young boy named Astyanax. To the soldiers of Troy, he was their greatest warrior. To the people behind the walls, he was their protector. But to his family, he was simply a husband and a father. And perhaps that was what made Hector so different from Achilles. Achilles fought because he was extraordinary. Hector fought because he had to. Every morning, when Hector put on his bronze armor, he knew that somewhere inside Troy were the people he loved. His father was growing old. His mother had already endured years of fear. His wife waited for him. His little son was growing up beneath the shadow of war. And yet Hector continued to walk toward the battlefield. He did not fight because he believed himself immortal. He fought because there was no one else he could become. Troy was his home. Its walls had protected generations before him. Its temples, houses, markets, and narrow streets were filled with memories. The people knew him. They called his name when he returned from battle. They trusted him to stand between them and the armies waiting outside. But behind that strength was a man who understood exactly what war could take away. One day, before returning to battle, Hector went to find Andromache. She stood near the walls with their young son in her arms. Andromache had already known loss. Her own family had been destroyed during the war, and Hector was the last person she could truly call home. She feared that one day he would leave through the gates and never return. She begged him to stay, not because she believed he was a coward. She feared that his courage would kill him. She could see the battlefield below. She could see the Greek army, and she knew that somewhere among those thousands of warriors was Achilles. Hector knew the same thing. He knew what Achilles was capable of, but he could not remain behind the walls. If he stayed, others would have to fight in his place. So Hector looked at his son. The little boy saw his father's armor and became frightened by the bronze helmet. For a moment, the great defender of Troy was no longer a warrior. He was simply a father. Hector removed his helmet and smiled. He reached for his son, and the fear disappeared. He held the child in his arms and prayed that the boy might one day become stronger and greater than his father. It was a quiet moment. No swords, no shouting, no armies. Only a father holding his child beneath the walls of a city that might not survive the war. And then Hector had to leave. He put his helmet back on. The man who had been holding his son disappeared behind bronze. The warrior returned. This is what separates Hector from Achilles. Achilles had chosen a short life filled with glory. Hector had never been offered such a simple choice. He wanted to live. He wanted to return to his wife. He wanted to watch his son grow older. But he also knew that if Troy fell, everything he loved would be placed in danger. His courage was therefore not the absence of fear. It was the decision to walk forward while knowing exactly what he might lose. And as Hector returned to the battlefield, Troy watched him from behind its walls. The people saw their champion, but they could not see the thoughts inside his heart. They could not see the husband who had just said goodbye to his wife. They could not see the father who had just held his child. They saw only Hector, the warrior. And perhaps that is why his story remains so powerful. Because Hector was not fighting for immortality. He was fighting for home. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Achilles remained inside his tent. The two greatest warriors of the war were moving toward opposite destinies. Achilles had withdrawn because his honor had been wounded. Hector continued because his home was threatened. One fought for glory, the other fought for the people he loved, and neither man yet knew how closely their paths were about to cross. For soon, Hector would find himself standing before the walls of Troy once again, and beyond those walls, the anger of Achilles was waiting. But before the two warriors met, the war would take something from Hector that would change everything. It would take away the one person who could bring Achilles back to the battlefield, Patroclus. For many years, Achilles had one person beside him who understood the man beneath the warrior. His name was Patroclus. The ancient stories describe their bond as an unusually deep friendship, built through years of companionship, hardship, and war. Where Achilles could be proud, fierce, and quick to anger, Patroclus was often gentler and more thoughtful. He could speak to Achilles when others could not. He could calm him when anger threatened to consume him. They were different, but somehow they belonged together. And now, with Achilles refusing to fight, Patroclus watched the Greek army slowly fall apart. Every day, the situation became worse. The Trojans were no longer simply defending their city. Hector was leading them toward the Greek ships. The Greeks were exhausted. Their defenses were breaking. Their ships, their only path home, were in danger of being burned. Inside his tent, Achilles could hear the sounds of battle. He knew what was happening, but he still refused to return. Patroclus could not simply sit and watch. He went to Achilles and saw the despair spreading through the Greek camp. Men were wounded. Others were dying. The Trojans were getting closer. Patroclus begged Achilles to help. If Achilles would not fight, perhaps he could at least allow Patroclus to enter the battlefield wearing his armor. The sight of Achilles' armor might frighten the Trojans. They might believe that Achilles had finally returned. Perhaps that would be enough to push them back from the ships. At first, Achilles hesitated, but eventually he agreed. He gave Patroclus his armor. The bronze pieces were placed over Patroclus's body, the helmet, the breastplate, the greaves, the shield, the weapons, and when Patroclus finally stood fully armed, he looked like Achilles. For a moment, it was almost as though the greatest warrior among the Greeks had returned. Outside the tent, the soldiers saw him. Hope spread through the camp. The Greeks gathered around Patroclus. They believed that perhaps the long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Achilles was returning, but they were wrong. It was Patroclus, and Patroclus knew that. He climbed into his chariot and led the Greek warriors toward the battlefield. When the Trojans saw the familiar armor approaching, fear passed through their ranks. They believed Achilles had returned. The man they feared most was coming for them. The Trojan lines began to break. Patroclus pressed forward. For a moment, the Greeks began to regain the ground they had lost. The ships were no longer completely helpless. The Trojans were pushed back, and Patroclus, carried forward by courage and perhaps by the feeling that he was finally doing something that could save his friends, continued deeper into the battle. But there was danger in his success. Achilles had warned him not to pursue the Trojans too far. He had told Patroclus to drive them away from the ships, then return. But the battlefield was changing around him. Victory seemed close. The Trojans were retreating, and Patroclus continued forward. Soon he was fighting far beyond the place Achilles had intended him to reach. The gods themselves began to interfere. The battle became confused. Men struggled to see through dust, smoke, and the movement of thousands of warriors. And somewhere among them was Hector. He realized that the warrior wearing Achilles' armor was not Achilles at all. It was Patroclus. The truth became clear, and Hector turned toward him. The two warriors met on the battlefield. Patroclus fought bravely, but fate was already closing around him. He was wounded. His strength began to fail. His armor could not protect him from what was coming. Hector struck. Patroclus fell. The man who had worn Achilles' armor now lay dying beneath the walls of Troy, and Hector took Achilles' armor from his body. The news would soon reach the Greek camp, but Achilles did not yet know. He did not yet know that the friend who had stood beside him through years of war was gone. He did not yet know that the decision to remain inside his tent had changed everything, because Achilles had believed that his anger would punish the Greeks. Instead, it had placed Patroclus on the battlefield, and now Patroclus was dead. When the news finally reached Achilles, something inside him would break. The anger that had once begun with Briseis would become something far more dangerous. It would no longer be about honor. It would no longer be about Agamemnon. It would no longer even be about himself. It would be about grief. And from that grief, the greatest warrior of the Greek army would rise once again. But this time, Achilles would not return to the battlefield for glory. He would return for Patroclus. And Troy would soon learn what happens when Achilles has nothing left to lose. When the news finally reached Achilles, he was no longer the same man who had sat quietly inside his tent. Patroclus was dead. For a moment, the sounds of the camp seemed to disappear. The voices of the soldiers, the movement of the horses, the distant clash of weapons, all of it faded into silence. Achilles heard only one thing. His friend was gone, the man who had stood beside him through years of war. The man who had spoken to him when anger had taken hold of his heart. The man who had worn his armor into battle because Achilles himself had refused to fight. Now Patroclus would never return. Achilles fell into grief. He tore at his hair and covered himself with dust. His sorrow was so great that the people around him feared for him. The anger that had once burned against Agamemnon was now transformed into something far more powerful. He blamed himself. If he had returned to the battlefield earlier, Patroclus might still have been alive. If he had put aside his pride, his friend might never have needed to wear his armor. If he had fought beside him, perhaps Hector would never have reached him. But there was no way to change what had already happened. Patroclus was dead, and Achilles knew what he had to do. He would return to the battlefield, not for Agamemnon, not for the Greek army, not for honor, for Patroclus. His mother, Thetis, came to him from the sea. She saw the grief in her son's face and understood what was coming. Achilles told her that he would return to battle, even though he knew that his own death would come soon afterward. Thetis knew the truth of his fate. She knew that if Achilles killed Hector, his own life would soon be drawing toward its end. But there was nothing she could do to change destiny. Instead, she promised to help him prepare. Achilles needed new armor. The armor Patroclus had worn was now in the hands of Hector. So Thetis went to the divine craftsman Hephaestus. Through the night, new weapons were forged. Bronze was shaped by divine hands. A new shield was created for Achilles, and the ancient stories describe it as far more than a simple piece of armor. Upon it was represented an entire world, the earth and the heavens, the sea, cities, fields, celebrations, disputes, harvests, stars, and the lives of ordinary people. It was almost as though Achilles was being given a shield containing the world he was about to leave behind. When the new armor finally arrived, Achilles put it on. The warrior who had disappeared from the battlefield was returning, but this was no longer the same Achilles. The proud young man who had withdrawn because his honor had been wounded was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by grief. He entered the battlefield, and the Trojans saw him. They knew immediately it was Achilles. The fear that had once spread through their ranks returned. Men who had fought confidently only moments before began to retreat. The sound of Achilles' return traveled across the plain. The Greeks found courage again. The Trojans began moving toward the safety of their walls, but Achilles was not interested in simply pushing them back. He wanted Hector. He wanted the man who had killed Patroclus. The battlefield became a storm of bronze and dust. Achilles moved through it with terrifying speed. He fought with a fury that seemed almost beyond human control. Men fell before him. The Trojans fled. Some tried to reach the city gates. Others were trapped between the Greek army and the river. Achilles continued forward. His anger seemed to consume everything around him. Even the river itself, according to the ancient story, rose against him after so many bodies were thrown into its waters. The gods watched. The mortals fought, and Achilles continued searching for Hector. Nothing else mattered. Not the war, not the treasures of Troy, not Agamemnon, not even the glory he had once desired. Only Hector, only Patroclus, and the promise Achilles had made in the darkness of his grief. He would not rest until the man responsible for his friend's death had fallen. The Trojans finally understood what they were facing. The greatest warrior among the Greeks had returned. But he had returned carrying something more dangerous than a spear. He was carrying grief, and grief had transformed his anger into something unstoppable. Behind the walls of Troy, Hector waited. He knew that Achilles was coming for him. And for the first time, the defender of Troy had to face the possibility that there might be no escape. The two men had been moving toward this moment since the beginning of the war. One had fought for his home. The other had returned for his friend. Now there was nowhere left for either of them to turn. Soon, beneath the walls of Troy, Achilles and Hector would finally meet, and one of them would not walk away. Hector stood outside the walls of Troy. Behind him were the gates of his city, the people he had sworn to protect, his father Priam, his wife Andromache, and his young son Astyanax. Before him stood Achilles. The greatest warrior among the Greeks was approaching across the battlefield, wearing the new armor forged for him by the gods. Hector looked at him and understood immediately. Achilles had not returned simply to fight. He had returned for him. For a moment, Hector remained where he was. Then fear took hold. He turned and ran. The great defender of Troy, the warrior who had faced armies and led thousands of men into battle, was now running from a single man. Achilles followed. Around the walls of Troy, the two warriors ran beneath the watchful eyes of the gods and the people of the city. Hector ran because he knew what Achilles had become. He had seen the bodies left behind by Achilles' return. He had seen the fury in his eyes, and he knew that he had killed the one person Achilles loved most. But Hector could not run forever. Eventually, he stopped. He turned toward Achilles. The two men stood facing each other beneath the walls of Troy. For a moment, everything became quiet. No armies, no shouting, no distant fires, only two men who had been moving toward this moment for years. Hector spoke. He asked Achilles to promise that whoever won would return the body of the fallen warrior to his people. Achilles refused. His heart was still filled with grief for Patroclus. There would be no mercy. The duel began. Hector raised his shield. Achilles lifted his spear. The two warriors moved around each other, watching for the smallest opening. Hector was brave. He had faced death many times before, but Achilles was different. He was fighting with the knowledge that his own death was approaching, and there was something terrifying about a man who believed he had already lost everything. Hector threw his spear. Achilles avoided it. He looked for an opening, and then he saw it, a small gap in Hector's armor near his neck. Achilles struck. Hector fell. The greatest defender of Troy was dead. For a moment, Achilles simply stood over him. The man who had killed Patroclus was finally lying at his feet, but the death of Hector did not bring peace. It did not bring satisfaction. It only deepened Achilles' anger. He remembered Patroclus. He remembered the grief. He remembered the days he had spent sitting inside his tent while his friend went into battle wearing his armor. And now Hector was dead. Achilles ordered the Greeks to take Hector's body. The ancient story tells us that he tied the body to his chariot and dragged it behind him around the walls of Troy. It was an act of terrible anger and humiliation. The people of Troy watched from above. They saw the body of their greatest defender being carried away. Inside the city, Hector's family could only watch in grief. His father, Priam, could do nothing. Andromache had lost her husband. Astyanax had lost his father. Troy had lost the man who had stood between the city and destruction, but Achilles still could not let him go. Night came. The battlefield became quiet. The fires of the Greek camp burned beneath the stars. And somewhere behind the walls of Troy, a father mourned his son. Achilles had won the greatest duel of his life. He had defeated Hector. He had taken revenge for Patroclus. Yet there was something strangely empty in his victory, because Hector's death could not bring Patroclus back. And Achilles was beginning to discover something that every warrior eventually learns. Victory cannot always heal grief. Sometimes, revenge only leaves a deeper silence behind. But the story was not finished, because that night, an old man would make a journey that no warrior would dare to make. King Priam would leave the safety of Troy. He would walk into the camp of the man who had killed his son, and he would ask Achilles for the one thing the warrior had refused to give, the body of Hector. And when those two men finally stood face to face, the anger of Achilles would meet something even more powerful, the grief of a father. Night had fallen over the Greek camp. The fires that had burned fiercely during the day were now smaller, their flames moving gently in the darkness. The sounds of battle had disappeared, and the soldiers were finally resting after another day of bloodshed. Inside his tent, Achilles sat alone. Hector was dead. Patroclus was still dead, and yet Achilles could not find peace. Outside, Hector's body remained under guard, but somewhere beyond the Greek camp, inside the walls of Troy, an old father was mourning his son. His name was Priam. King Priam had watched Hector grow from a child into the greatest defender of Troy. He had watched him leave through the gates again and again, always wondering whether his son would return. Now he knew that Hector would never come home, and yet Priam could not accept that his son's body should remain in the hands of his enemy. So, in the darkness, the old king made a decision that seemed almost impossible. He would go to Achilles himself. Priam left the safety of Troy. He crossed the dark plain with only a small group of companions. The Greek camp was dangerous. Every man there was an enemy, and yet Priam continued forward. Eventually, he reached the tent of Achilles. The guards allowed him to enter. Achilles looked up, and there, standing before him, was the king of Troy, the father of Hector. For a moment, neither man spoke. Priam then approached Achilles. He fell before him and took the hands of the man who had killed his son. He begged him to remember his own father, Peleus, an old man waiting far away in Achilles' homeland. Priam asked Achilles to imagine what it would be like if Peleus were standing where he was now. What if Achilles had died? What if his father had to cross an enemy camp in the darkness simply to bring his son's body home? Achilles listened, and something changed inside him. The anger that had burned so fiercely since the death of Patroclus began to soften. He looked at the old man before him. He no longer saw only the king of Troy. He saw a father, a grieving father who had lost his son. And suddenly, Achilles remembered his own father. Peleus was far away, old, waiting. And Achilles knew something that Priam did not yet know. One day, Peleus would also lose his son. The thought broke through the anger. Achilles began to weep. Priam wept too. For a brief moment, there were no Greeks and Trojans, no enemies, no armies, no kings, only two human beings mourning the people they had lost. Achilles finally agreed to return Hector's body. He ordered his men to prepare it with care. The body that had been treated with anger was now given back to the father who had come for it, and Achilles gave Priam time. Time to take his son home, time to mourn, time to prepare the funeral. When Hector's body returned to Troy, the city gathered around him. Andromache mourned her husband. Helen mourned the man who had always treated her with kindness. Hecuba mourned her son. And Priam mourned the child he had once held in his arms. The people of Troy prepared Hector's funeral. They gathered wood. They brought offerings. They spoke of his courage. They remembered the man he had been before the war consumed his life. Then they placed Hector upon the funeral pyre. The flames rose slowly into the night, and Troy became quiet. The war was not yet over. The city had not yet fallen. Achilles was still alive. The Greeks were still waiting outside the walls, but something had ended. The story of the Iliad had reached its final moment, not with the fall of Troy, not with the death of Achilles, not with the Trojan horse, but with the funeral of Hector. The greatest defender of Troy had been returned to his people. And Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, had finally allowed his anger to become grief. Two enemies had met in the darkness and discovered something that war could never completely destroy: their humanity. And perhaps that is why the Iliad has survived for thousands of years. Because beneath the armor, beneath the legends, beneath the gods and the battles, there were people who loved, people who feared, people who lost, people who mourned, and people who, even in the middle of a terrible war, could still recognize the pain of another human being. The flames of Hector's funeral slowly faded, and as the night grew quiet over Troy, the Iliad came to an end. But the story of Achilles had not yet reached its final chapter. But the story of Achilles did not end there. The funeral of Hector brings the Iliad itself to an end, but the story of the Trojan War continued in the wider tradition of ancient Greek mythology. This distinction is important. The Iliad does not tell us the complete story of the Trojan War. It focuses on a short period near the end of the conflict, especially on the anger of Achilles and everything that followed from it. So when we speak about the death of Achilles, we are moving beyond the Iliad itself and into the larger collection of stories surrounding the Trojan War. And in those stories, Achilles' fate was waiting for him. After Hector's funeral, the war continued. Achilles remained the greatest warrior among the Greeks, but he was no longer simply the young man who had entered the war seeking glory. He had seen too much. He had lost Patroclus. He had killed Hector. He had stood before Priam and felt the pain of a father who had lost his son. And yet the prophecy surrounding his life had never changed. Achilles was destined to die young. The very glory he had chosen was connected to his death. He could not escape it forever. The Greeks continued fighting against Troy, and Achilles continued to take part in the battles. But eventually, another Trojan prince would stand between Achilles and his destiny. His name was Paris. Paris was the man whose relationship with Helen had helped bring the Greek armies to Troy in the first place. And now, according to the later traditions, he would become the man responsible for Achilles' death. The exact details vary between ancient sources and later retellings, but the basic story is one of the most famous episodes in the mythology of Troy. Achilles was fighting near the walls of the city when Paris attacked him. Paris was not the warrior Hector had been. He did not possess Hector's reputation or Achilles' legendary strength. Instead, he relied upon his skill with the bow, and he was not alone. The god Apollo was associated with the attack, and in some versions of the story, guided Paris's arrow toward its target. The arrow struck Achilles, and the greatest warrior of the Greek army finally fell. There is something almost cruelly beautiful about the way the story completes itself. Achilles had spent his entire life moving toward glory. He had known that a short life and eternal fame were waiting on one side of his choice, while a long and ordinary life waited on the other. He had chosen the first, and now his fate had arrived. Later traditions would make his death even more famous. They told the story of his mother, Thetis, attempting to protect him from mortality. One of the most famous versions says that when Achilles was a child, Thetis dipped him into the river Styx, hoping to make his body invulnerable. But she held him by one part of his body, his heel. That small place remained vulnerable, and so, when Paris' arrow struck Achilles, it found the one place where the great warrior could still be wounded, his heel. From this later legend came the expression we still use today. An Achilles' heel is a person's hidden weakness, the one small vulnerability that can bring down someone who otherwise seems almost impossible to defeat. But there is an important detail here. The famous story of the vulnerable heel is not actually part of Homer's Iliad. It belongs to later traditions surrounding Achilles. The same is true of the famous image of Paris killing Achilles with an arrow guided by Apollo. The Iliad itself does not tell Achilles' death, and perhaps that makes the ending even more powerful. Homer leaves Achilles alive. We know that his fate is coming. We know that he has chosen a short life. We know that the gods and destiny are already moving around him. But the poem closes before the final moment. The great warrior remains standing at the edge of the story, and beyond that edge lies death. Achilles had once believed that glory could make a mortal immortal. In one sense, he was right. His body could die, his life could end, but his name survived. Thousands of years later, we still speak of Achilles. We still remember his anger. We remember Patroclus. We remember Hector. We remember the old King Priam entering his tent. and we remember the choice that shaped his entire life. Achilles wanted a name that would never disappear. He achieved it, but there was a price. The greatest warrior of the Greek world could not defeat his own mortality. His armor could not protect him forever. His strength could not save him. His mother was a goddess, but he was still mortal. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of Achilles. He spent his life trying to become more than human, while his fate was constantly reminding him that he was human after all. His rage made him legendary. His friendship made him human. His grief changed him. And his death completed the destiny he had chosen long before the walls of Troy disappeared behind the horizon. The warrior who seemed almost impossible to defeat finally fell, not because he was weak, but because even the greatest heroes could not escape the limits of their own lives. And somewhere in the darkness of ancient memory, the name of Achilles remained, not as an immortal god, but as something perhaps even more enduring, a story. The fall of Troy came after the events described in the Iliad. The famous Trojan horse, one of the most recognizable images of the entire war, is not actually part of Homer's Iliad. It belongs to the wider tradition of stories about the Trojan War, where the Greeks finally entered the city through deception, and Troy was brought to its end. The war was over. The walls that had stood for so many years could no longer protect the city. The heroes were gone. Hector was dead. Achilles was dead. Patroclus was dead. And the people who had once believed that Troy might stand forever were left with only ashes, memories, and stories. But the story itself did not die, because the Iliad was never only a story about a war. It was a story about anger and how anger can consume even the greatest of men. It was a story about love in all its forms, the love between Helen and Paris, the love of Hector for Andromache and his little son, the friendship between Achilles and Patroclus, the grief of a father who lost his child, and the terrible knowledge that no amount of courage can defeat fate forever. Achilles wanted glory. Hector wanted to protect his home. Priam wanted his son back, and all of them in the end discovered the same truth. Being human comes with a price. We love, and therefore we can lose. We hope, and therefore we can be disappointed. We fight for what matters to us, knowing that one day even the strongest among us must let go. Perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, we are still listening to the story of Achilles. And now, as the fires of Troy slowly fade into the darkness, our journey through the world of Achilles comes to an end. Tonight, we have walked through the ancient streets of Troy, stood beside its warriors, followed Achilles into battle, and witnessed the anger that changed the fate of an entire army. We saw love, friendship, sacrifice, grief, and loss. We saw how even the greatest warrior could not escape his own fate. And perhaps, as you let these ancient stories slowly disappear into the quiet of the night, you can leave the battlefield behind. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. Just close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the story of Achilles become a distant memory beneath the stars. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history. Good night.